China makes up more than 30% of global emissions, so incredibly significant, and even more significant when you look at emissions growth. So over the past decade, since the Paris Climate Conference, China was responsible for more than 2/3 of the increase in global emissions. So if and when China's emissions do peak, that will bring the global emissions peak at least to well within reach, if not making it guaranteed. So this year, the newly added solar, wind, hydro, nuclear power generation in China will be enough to generate the annual power consumption of the UK twice over, or well over Germany's total power consumption.
Welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas. I'm Mark Lynas, and I've had a few bad ideas in my time. I used to go out in the nighttime to destroy GMO crops, and I also opposed nuclear power. But then when I looked at the science, I found I got it wrong. Oops! I've learned the hard way that none of us are right all the time. So now I'm here to challenge the assumptions that we all too often take for granted, because the future depends on us getting it right. My guest today is Lauri Myllyvirta, who's the co-founder and lead analyst at the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air, and someone whose work I've admired for a long time because he really gets into the figures about energy issues, and particularly regarding China, which is going to be mostly what we talk about today. And you can read most of Lauri's posts on Carbon Brief, which is the go-to site for climate information of all sorts. So, Lauri, welcome.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure, and thanks for coming. You're in Finland, are you?
Yeah, that's where I'm based.
Yeah. I heard you speak a whole load of languages. Tell me a bit about your past career, because I know also you worked at Greenpeace.
Yeah, I did. So yeah, it's always hard to define what's the bar for actually speaking a language. But so I do use Chinese and Indonesian professionally, and used to be able to speak enough Swedish and French to do interviews and presentations and so on. A bit of German, and I lived in the Netherlands and Poland, picked up enough to be able to handle the day-to-day stuff, but certainly not professionally.
Well, that's pretty incredible. So you're clearly some kind of mega brain, which is even more exciting having you on the show as for that reason. Obviously, we're all here saving the world from bad ideas, and I thought, given your recent work, the bad idea could be that China's burning more coal. China's emissions are always going up. I'm not sure exactly how we want to phrase it, but this idea that you hear all the time that China's building 2 coal-fired power stations a week, so therefore we shouldn't do anything about climate, which has been the kind of go-to excuse for many people for, I don't know, a decade or two at least. And actually, it's your latest analysis of China, which was hit the headlines this week, just pretty much as we're recording this. I won't break the news; I'll let you do that. But it seems to me that this is the biggest story in climate change right now. It's bigger than COP30. It's really, really, really significant what's going on in China. So tell me what your latest analysis says.
So my latest quarterly piece found that China's emissions up to September 2025 had been stable or falling for 18 months straight. And it's the first time that emissions are falling while energy consumption and electricity consumption are growing at or above their historical norms. So the growth in clean energy has reached the scale where it can cover the average growth in electricity and energy demand. There's 2 really important sectors that stand out for the progress. It's of course the power sector, where the additions of especially solar, also wind, this year have been absolutely staggering. And then it's the transportation sector, where electrification has really started to happen and started to eat into the use of oil for transportation. There's a 5% drop in CO2 emissions from transport fuels in the first 9 months of the year.
Yeah, because isn't China something like a quarter of global emissions? I mean, it's absolutely huge, right? So if China's I mean, you can correct me because that's probably wrong. But if China's actually peaking its emissions this year, that will have effect on the global emissions peak too. So what are your projections about these two things?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So China makes up more than 30% of global emissions. So incredibly significant, and even more significant when you look at emissions growth. So over the past decade, since the Paris Climate Conference, China was responsible for more than 2/3 of the increase in global emissions. So even when China's emissions do peak, that will bring the global emissions peak at least to well within reach, if not making it guaranteed.
So it's a bit like an election, isn't it, where it's too close to call? I mean, are you actually calling a China emissions peak this year, or is it still a bit premature for that?
Not yet, unfortunately. So the counteracting forces are that China's decision makers are in fact leaving the door open or even planning for a rebound in emissions over the next few years. So when China announced the much-awaited 2035 emission targets, they set the greenhouse gas emission reduction target from unspecified peak levels. So leaving open the possibility that emissions would still increase, fixing the emission reduction on the basis of 2024 or 2025 emissions would have been a much firmer basis. And recently, the Central Committee of the Communist Party, so really the highest organ in the country's policy making, recommended that the next 5-year plan should aim for peaking before coal and oil consumption during the 5-year period, and so on. So clearly there is this a space that the decision makers are still leaving. And the background is that the clean energy boom in the country has in fact progressed a lot faster than the government was targeting. So their plan all along was to gradually ramp things up so that they would be prepared to peak sometime before 2030, but not in 2024-25. But they basically the expansion of manufacturing and deployment of solar, electric vehicles, and so on took on a life of its own, and now it's gotten to the scale where it seems to be driving a faster emissions peak. So it's highly uncertain. It's very clear that China has the capability to peak right now, but the peaking target before 2030 always involved a kind of a bargain that there's still space for the coal industry and the fossil industry to grow up to late 2020s, and that's then after that is the time that they really have to start downsizing. So to me, it seems that the decision makers are just not prepared to override that implicit bargain between interest groups by actually acknowledging that emissions might be peaking right now.
It's weird though. I mean, I'm a climate optimist, so I'm going to call it. I think emissions are peaking this year, and I'll put €50 bet on this. Would you bet against me or not?
I probably would not. I think it's very close to a coin toss, and I'm not the kind of person who bets on a 50-50 chance.
That's because you're a numbers person. This is probably why I always lose money when I go gambling. Listen, you mentioned about the clean energy boom in China, and I think people have a sort of faint understanding that this is happening and that China's turning into the world's first electro state, as it's been termed. And of course, China's leading the world with solar and wind and batteries and so on. I really struggle to appreciate the scale of this. I know it's like hundreds of gigawatts, but what do they even mean? So can you give us a sense of what the clean energy boom actually looks like on the ground in China?
For sure. So let's start with the increase, the growth in clean power generation. So this year, the newly added solar, wind, hydro, nuclear power generation in China will be enough to generate the annual power consumption of the UK twice over, or well over Germany's total power consumption. So absolutely huge numbers. In terms of installed capacity, last year China added 270 gigawatts of solar alone, which is roughly equal to what the EU had at that point. So almost the EU's total solar capacity in 1 year, and then it accelerated from there in the first half of this year. So over 200 gigawatts added in just 6 months, which is 100 solar panels added per second.
Wow. And this is all is solar in particular. I mean, this isn't going on people's rooftops, right? I mean, these are presumably huge, in industrial scale installations in desert areas or something. I mean, what's this actually look like in China?
It's split 50-50 between utility scale, so large solar farms, and distributed solar, which then distributed solar, about half of that or a bit less is residential, so actual rooftop, and the other half is industrial and commercial, which is part of it. The roof is rooftops, part of it is small installations on ground, but still distributed. So it is really I would say that the amount of distributed solar that China's been putting on, so about half of the total is maybe even the more impressive part. So China's total solar capacity is 3 times that of the EU, and if about half of that is distributed, then that's 1.5 times the EU's total capacity, and it's based on this model of one important driver of it is this model of whole county solar, which means that a county or a village will set a target of deploying X gigawatts of solar panels covering X percent of roofs, suitable roofs with solar panels, and then they engage a firm to implement it that negotiates with building owners, negotiates with grids, does the acquisition of the equipment, contracts the installation and so on, which makes it much lower cost and much faster to deploy. So it's almost centralized deployment of distributed solar, but it's a very smart model, especially for places where the grid company might be the issue. So it could work well in a lot of other countries as well.
And how are they dealing with the intermittency issue with, solar and wind both? I mean, as renewables, they're not dispatchable. They happen when the weather happens to be favorable and it's not nighttime in the case of solar. So how do you actually create like a massive industrialized country grid based on this amount of solar, and in fact an increasing amount of solar?
China's starting point before the wind and solar deployment started off was a grid dominated by coal and hydro, both of which can be ramped up and down, obviously. So you have a system where you can add a very significant amount of wind and solar by making the generation from the coal and hydro plants flexible and responsive to the variations in demand and the variations in solar and wind supply. That has been a very gradual process. So China first started to have problems with accommodating wind in the grid almost 15 years ago. So what happens when you're having this problem is called curtailment. So you're not feeding all of the electricity that a wind turbine or a solar panel could generate into the grid. You're losing some of it, and these rates of curtailment went up quite sharply in the early 2010s. And at that point, China had a minuscule amount of wind and almost no solar compared with today. So the starting point was that the grid and the power plants were operating in a highly inflexible way. They were basically running on schedules, and that was because you hadn't had intermittent generation, and also because electricity demand at that point had been incredibly stable and predictable because it was so heavily dominated by industrial consumption. And now then over the past 15 years, China's of course added a massive amount of wind and solar, and electricity demand has become a lot more variable because you have a lot more demand for air conditioning, especially, which causes spikes and so on. And so China's gradually been making the grid and the power plants operate more flexibly, but there's still a long way to go. Now there's a perception that the grid is running into limits on this, but China's still at only around 20% of power generation coming from wind and solar, whereas quite a few other countries have been able to get into the high 20s or 30s without running into these problems. So it still shows that China has a long way to go, especially in making the power transmission between provinces flexible. So the transmission between provinces still tends to run on schedule, whereas what you would want is that when you have high supply of wind in one province, then other provinces generate less locally and import more from that province, and that would enable you to accommodate a lot more. But so the other thing that has started to happen is very large scale investment in electricity storage. So the amount of battery storage just hit 100 gigawatts in the first half of this year. So that's already almost now at 10% of the peak electricity demand could be covered by discharging batteries if all of them were discharging at the same time.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about batteries because that's the other sort of part of the story, isn't it? Do you envisage a future where there's enough battery capacity to balance the whole grid on a kind of clean energy basis indefinitely without any fossil?
Batteries have a kind of specific role, so they're amazing for covering especially the evening peak in electricity. So one time that electricity consumption tends to be high is in the evening when people get home and run off all of their appliances and so on, and that tends to be a bit after the sun goes down or goes low enough that you don't get a lot of solar generation. So that's the time where if you charge the batteries during the day and discharge during the evening, that can increase the amount of solar that you can incorporate into a power system a lot, especially in systems that have a lot of need for air conditioning. And there are a lot, but so batteries are not suitable for evening out demand over and supply over weeks or months because the capacity required would be way too large. China's also building quite a bit of pumped hydro storage, and one good thing is that in China the generation from solar doesn't vary quite as much from summer to winter as in Northern Europe, for example. So you do get substantial solar generation also during the winter, and there are really good ways of managing this in the winter because China has a large district heating system covering a lot of cities, and that works very well as an energy storage as well. So it's going to be a combination of a lot of different things, but batteries will be one important piece in the puzzle.
I mean, China's so huge that presumably the weather is different in different parts of the country at the same time. So long as they've got the ability to transmit electricity, nationwide, which I assume they do. The grid is there, right, to take energy from wind in, I don't know, Inner Mongolia or Xinjiang all the way over to Beijing and to the south. And does it work like that, or is it more kind of distributed?
Increasingly so. China's made enormous investments into very long distance transmission lines, spanning exactly from Xinjiang all the way to the coast. So one thing that was just mentioned in the most recent quarterly press conference by the Energy Administration was that they're using solar power generation from the very west of China to cover the evening peak in the eastern demand centers. So exactly what you're describing, it's starting to happen. The challenge has been that those transmission lines run very inflexibly. What would need to happen, especially for wind, is that when there's a lot of wind power generation in northern and western China, that then the lines transmit more electricity to the east, and the eastern provinces ramp down their own generation to make space for that. But that has been hard to negotiate. I think the country will get there. They're creating hour-to-hour electricity trading, which uses prices to incentivize this, and they are also doing much more of that administratively. But it's a long process involving a lot of negotiation and provinces that want to protect their own generation from import and so on.
Yeah, you mentioned about pricing. I'm kind of curious about how this all works. Like, is China a communist country which is now fully capitalist, or is there still state planning in energy, or is it all based on the market and the utilities are privately owned, or what? Can you kind of give me a sense of how China works in this sense?
Power generating companies are state-owned, or at least majority state-owned. You have two national grid operators, State Grid running most of the country, but they're very provincially segregated. So the provincial grids operate quite independently, and the reason that the State Grid likes these long distance transmission lines, or one key reason, is that they administer those directly rather than going through the provinces. Then the key electricity buyers are the distribution companies, which are the provincial grid operators, and large industrial electricity users, which are also largely state-owned. So the state-owned sector plays a big role in this, and the way that state-owned firms in China operate is that they do have a profit motive. They do have a motive to pursue market share, but they can also be directed politically, and that's why China is able to execute so many of these coordinated plans that involve manufacturing and generation and upstream resources and so on, because all of these state-owned firms, they're basically running on market incentives by default, but then they can be directed to pursue the plans of the provinces and the central government. And so that means that, say, for example, the expansion of coal-fired power capacity that is still taking place, that was very much something that the state-owned firms were told to do. It doesn't matter if it makes money or not, you're going to build them because we want to have that as an insurance.
And do you have NIMBYs in China? I mean, I imagine it's not terribly democratic. Obviously, it's not at a national level. I imagine it's not at a local level either. So do you have a planning system where people can object or anything like that? Or is it literally somebody decides from higher up and then it gets built pretty quickly?
There is quite a lot of NIMBYism. So people will object. There are famously these landowners, building owners who have refused to sell to a developer and then have gotten stuck in the middle of a large development with their house, and so on. And the government at different levels is somewhat sensitive to protests. So one example is that nuclear power is still not being built in inland locations, and that's partially because of genuine concern about what would happen if you had some kind of an even minor nuclear incident, let's say along a river, but largely driven by concern about the public acceptance of that. There are also cases, if rare, of, for example, coal-fired power plant projects not being built because of air pollution concerns and so on. But so there's of course the government does have an ability to override or ignore local protest and concerns and opposition when they choose to, but their preference generally is to try to navigate around it.
Yeah, I mean, I asked because people in China are, the same as anyone really. And, I did some work in the country on GMOs, and it was a very fraught issue. And there was a lot of fear and a lot of kind of conspiracizing about it. And I remember when Fukushima happened in Japan, the Chinese went crazy and were buying iodine salt and, things, even though, of course, there was no radiation at all coming from Japan to China, and so the risk was just not there. But obviously there's a lot of kind of nuclear phobia and all the rest of it, so there's no channel for that, I guess, but it must affect the national government. And I actually did want to ask you about other kind of, well, at least non-fossil sectors, like what's happening with nuclear in China. You hear that they're building huge numbers of reactors, but how significant is that, and is it looking like it's going to continue into the future?
So the target in the current 5-year plan was to start at least 10 new nuclear reactor projects a year, and that has been followed very precisely. So every year from 2022 to 2025 this year, 10 reactor projects have been approved with total capacity of more than 10 gigawatts. So that's happening. It's faster than before, and it's significant. So it will make a contribution, of course, to the clean energy growth, but it's a fraction of what wind and solar are delivering in terms of added annual generation. But then when you zoom in on the province level, it certainly becomes important for some provinces and a very important part of their strategy. And in general, I think it's very valuable that the clean electricity strategy has 3 legs to stand on: wind, solar, and nuclear, rather than just 2. There are also one thing that I think is very interesting and could become important is heating. So half of China's coal-fired power plant capacity is combined heat and power. So it provides both electricity and heat, either for heating buildings or for industrial processes. And for that part, how you're going to decarbonize that, there's no clear consensus yet. For power generation, it's quite clear that that wind and solar is going to be the brunt of it, and then there's a bit of varying views about how much of the rest you're going to cover with carbon capture and storage applied on coal or biomass, and how much you're going to cover with storage and nuclear and so on. But it's that at least for the next couple of decades, the direction is much clearer. But for heat, it's still much more open. So how much do you do with large scale heat pumps? What's the role of nuclear and carbon capture and storage and so on? The attractive thing about nuclear in this is that with this small and medium reactors that are being developed, ideally you could replace the coal plants that are currently providing both heat and power with nuclear reactors, and just replace the boiler, the heat source.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned SMRs. I was going to ask about that next, because it's sort of the one. Obviously, globally, there's been a huge amount of hype about SMRs. I mean, the stock for Oklo, I think it was, has gone through the roof, and there's a lot of talk about the nuclear renaissance being based on these small modular reactors. But it's the one sort of clean tech sector that China hasn't dominated in yet. Nobody's dominated in it because no one's actually made the SMRs that everyone's talking about. But how's China positioning itself on that?
So they have a model that is being deployed. I think 125 megawatt model, so more medium-sized reactor. The recent permitting that I was talking about in the past few years, that's large reactors, so more than 1 gigawatt capacity. So that's still the mainstay, will certainly still be for the next 5 years. But then with the small and medium reactors piloting now, then you could see them being deployed in 2030s, but the location issue is the big one. So so far, China's still stuck with only building plants on the coast, and that really restricts site selection. It doesn't play into the advantages of small and medium, and of course, heavily restricts the provinces where you can build. So that will be the key question: whether these new designs are deemed to be safe enough and publicly acceptable enough to be deployed at very large numbers in inland locations.
What about hydro? I mean, obviously the Three Gorges Dam was the biggest in the world at that time. Isn't there some other ginormous hydroelectric dam now in the offing?
Yeah, there is another even larger project that is progressing and very contentious because of the implications on downstream countries. So it's another thing that in any other country in the world would be a game changer. In China, it's a nice addition to everything else that's happening in terms of the terawatt hours, the amount of electricity that it generates. Of course, whether it's nice or not is subject to debate, as I said. But in terms of the scale, it's just everything is big in China simply because of the scale of the energy system, and it's important to separate the small bigs from the big bigs.
Everything's big in China. Also, everything's new in China. I mean, I was there 5 or 6 years ago, and I was just blown away by literally just how modern it is. It makes you feel like, if you excuse the phrase, like coming back. It feels like the third world when you come to America. The infrastructure's degraded. There's potholes everywhere. Everything's dirty. Things don't work very well. Trains don't work in most of Europe. I mean, it's just not like that in China. And you've got huge gleaming cities with names no one's ever heard of in the West, and millions of people. And it's just like, I don't think people really understand just how far China is ahead, really, of the rest of the world, and certainly ahead of the West when it comes to, it's not just energy, but the whole sort of modern infrastructure, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. The amount of investment that goes into infrastructure is huge, and of course, so much of it was built recently. It's a very different approach to running the economy in general. So the Western market economy approach tends to be you spend the bare minimum, you can get way way with, and you're very thorough in making sure that not a single dollar or euro gets spent without getting the economic return from it. And that's, that kind of accountability for public resources is, of course, good. In China, it's more like effectiveness. You spend as much to make sure that you hit your targets, and don't worry too much if some of it is it doesn't have the rate of return that you would like. For better or worse, of course, that has meant massive overinvestment in things like coal-based steelmaking, now coal-fired power plants, and in general a very energy-intensive economic development model. So the amount of steel and cement and energy that China uses per unit of GDP is much higher than the West and than most other emerging economies.
So their carbon intensity is still really high. In fact, I think they missed their government's carbon intensity targets. The one target that they did miss, I think, in the NDC. Just to go back to coal, which you mentioned. So they, as I understand it, they still are building in China new coal-fired power stations. Presumably, they're just not going to use them, or they're going to use all of the coal-fired power stations less proportionally. I mean, why build any new when coal's peaking and you don't need it, and you've got all of this new clean power going, and why still build more coal?
Right. So what happened is there was a wave of coal-fired power plant construction around 2015, and then after that, the government realized we're building too many of these things, and then started restricting permitting. Then in 2020, 2021, there were shortages of coal, the fuel, and shortages of electricity in different parts of China. The root cause for that was problems with how the electricity system is managed and how electricity was priced and so on. So it didn't pay for coal plants to operate. They were, if you run your coal plant, you lost money, and so then a lot of plants were just reporting that they're out of order, or they didn't buy the coal that they needed to operate, and were not able to operate, and so on. So then the government responded with basically an all of the above response, where they launched a lot of reforms to address the root causes of these power shortages, and they launched a massive wave of investment in electricity storage, of course, in clean energy, and they launched a massive amount of new coal and gas-fired power projects. And so now the shortage issues have been essentially resolved, and almost none of the coal plants and gas plants permitted back then have come online yet. They're just starting to come online this year. So now you're left with, and this goes back to the effectiveness versus efficiency thing, that when you have a problem, you'd rather do three things when one or two would suffice than risk not solving the problem. But so that's left the policymakers in a bit of a dilemma, where they just can't keep the clean energy boom going and keep adding coal plants, and they have to make up their minds, but they clearly haven't yet. These coal plants are going to come online in the next 2 or 3 years. There's well over 200 gigawatts under construction, where China's current installed capacity is 1,100 gigawatts. So it's going to mean an around 20% increase in China's coal-fired capacity. And if the demand for power generation from coal is flat or declining, then that means that the average utilization of that capacity will go down by more than 20%, which will cause financial issues for many of those coal plants.
Does coal still cause the extent of air pollution, as was the case, 10 years or so ago, and famously around the Olympics? I've heard that China has reduced the sulfate emissions from its coal-fired power stations, and in fact, that's possibly one of the things that's contributing to this rapid pulse in global warming, because those sulfates, reflect solar radiation, and so we've got this sort of sudden amount of warming, obviously from shipping, pollution controls as well. I'm sure you know about this because you're, working also on clean air. So, tell me what the story is there.
China obviously had an enormous, dramatic air pollution problem 10, 15 years ago. What happened was there was an effort to clean up, at least around Beijing, in the run-up to the Summer Olympics of 2008. After that, there was a huge industrial boom, and the pollution came back even worse, and that caused a public uproar, a public call for addressing the issue. The most important thing, the government had already been requiring the use of sulfur emission controls, SO2 emission controls in power plants, but their use hadn't been enforced. They ramped up enforcement. They tightened the emission standards, both for SO2 and for NOx, which is the other major pollutant from coal plants. And then they introduced these ultra low emission standards, which were even stricter, but so very aggressively forcing coal-fired power plants to reduce their air pollutant emissions over the past a decade, and then doing the same thing for steel mills, which were an even bigger polluter around, especially around Beijing. And then the third big drive was eliminating the small-scale use of coal in buildings for heating, which was especially during winter was a major source of air pollution, and so these steps resulted in a much bigger improvement in air quality over a decade than I think anyone could imagine. I remember in early 2010s we were calculating that it would take Beijing 2-3 decades to reach China's national air quality standards, and that happened in early 2020s, in less than a decade after the action plan was launched. So huge improvement, but yes, a huge reduction in SO2 emissions, which seems to have led to a jump in global warming as well. And to me, to me, it's obvious that you can't require 1,000 million people to breathe toxic air as a way of geoengineering the planet and cooling the planet. But it does raise the question: if we were spraying all of this sulfur into the atmosphere before, then should we actually be somehow maintaining the cooling effect of that? But that's a very fraught, without the health impacts. But that's, of course, a very fraught conversation.
That is a very fraught conversation. We've got a couple of podcast episodes on it, looking at the solar radiation modification issue and so on. So let's not go down that rabbit hole here. But I'm curious, where'd you get your data from? I know you said you speak Mandarin. I mean, is this all this published sources that you happen to be able that you can access because you read Chinese, or do you have sources that you can go to in the government? Because, like I say, I mean, you're kind of the go-to analyst globally now on what's happening in energy in China, and how do you how do you actually do that? Like, what's the secret?
The main thing is that there's an astonishing amount of publicly available data. So if you take all the different statistical releases, all the reports by companies, government data on permitting of new projects, investments, all of these things, of course, customs data and so on, it amounts to a lot. In addition, there's quite a bit of government data that is not made available publicly, but that is available through financial sector information services. Often it's what happens is it's press conferences that take place physically that you have to go to, and you get the data on paper, or it's beamed or just read out from a paper, and then these financial data providers go to all of those conferences and meticulously note down all of those numbers and put them into databases that we access. So that's one a key source for my work, and so doing that lets us track China's fossil fuel consumption through using basically three different, largely separate data sets, which gives you a sense of how well they're aligned and whether there are discrepancies, and then you can go looking for the explanations for those discrepancies. But so overall, not just for China, but China is a good example. My sense is that there is a lot of data out there, and we're way too few people making sense of it. So besides just calculating year-on-year changes, whether it's air quality data or all of this data that is reported on the energy sector. We recently launched a similar tracking of CO2 emissions for India that is also based on compiling data from a very long list of government and commercial sources, almost all of them publicly available. But so that kind of effort is just something that we're doing to try to provide a much more timely and disaggregated picture of what's happening with CO2 emissions than is available from elsewhere.
I did want to also ask about EVs and the electrification of transport, because that's obviously the other big story in China, that we may even be seeing peak oil in terms of consumption and transport. So, like, what's the latest situation on that?
For passenger cars, EVs are already about 50% of vehicle sales, and they're around already about 10% of all the vehicles on the road, with the share going up fast. So it's already making a very meaningful dent to gasoline consumption. The very latest was that in October, which is an important holiday month in China, the 1st of October national holiday, gasoline consumption fell 8% year on year, and also fell compared with the previous month, despite the travel surge. So it really showed that those people who drove for the holiday were largely driving EVs. The other area besides the passenger cars are, of course, the segment that you hear about the most. But electrification of heavy vehicles is also really important. So China's been electrifying buses for a long time, and buses, because they have they of course have very high utilization. They're driven all day long. They are electrifying them makes a disproportionate dent in oil demand, and now the same thing is starting to happen with heavy trucks, which is really the big story of this year in terms of EVs. That electric trucks, semis, have really taken off in China, and it's also backed by really systematic investment in charging infrastructure. So super fast charging and expanding the networks, which then enables things like people being comfortable driving for holidays.
These EVs are also increasingly being exported. I mean, we've got BYD in the UK and in Europe now, and elsewhere, other companies as well, challenging Tesla and the other EV manufacturers. Now, there's a whole big story here, isn't there, about China's clean tech exports, and obviously solar and batteries, maybe wind to a lesser extent. So, like, China, I don't know. I mean, the big picture to me seems like China's not just decarbonizing itself; it's also helping decarbonize the world. What's your take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the drop in the cost of solar and batteries over the past few years, I think, is the energy story of the decade, because now it's really gotten to the level where solar with storage and EVs are competitive against fossil fuels just about anywhere in the world, or at least in those markets that matter. So that's going to drive much more broad-based and much more rapid adoption than anyone was projecting just a few years ago. And China plays a huge role in that. So basically what happened is China's clampdown on real estate led to a lot of capital, a lot of local governments, state-owned banks, and state-owned enterprises, and so on, asking, okay, so what are we going to do now? And they collectively, so many of them decided we're going to do the clean energy, and that led to an increase in scale and reduction in costs that is having a massive global impact.
Yeah, and as you say, it's the cheapest energy source. I mean, it's almost like solar baseload now, solar plus batteries, in all of the developing world, probably a lot of the global north as well. I don't think people really understand the extent to which this is a complete game changer in energy now. I mean, do you think people are beginning to get it, or is it still like, because we're now part of the way towards solving global warming with this? It's like, it's a really big deal, right?
You can certainly say that. So yeah, I don't have the sense that the breakthrough is really appreciated, and a part of that is that so many power companies have been slow to update their investment plans. So many governments have been slow to update their policies, energy policies, and so as it happens, the day that we're recording this, the International Energy Agency has released, or is just releasing, its World Energy Outlook, and if that shows anything, it shows that policymakers have not caught up to this yet, and in many countries, the winners will be those solutions that consumers and electricity users and motorists can adopt themselves, i.e. solar and batteries and EVs, because the governments are going to be lagging behind for some time.
Well, and famously, IEA and all the other conventional agency forecasts of the uptake of renewables and clean energy generally have always been pessimistic. They've always had them leveling off. If you look back, and there's that famous chart of them, they all level, and in fact, it goes up. Almost like a vertical line. It's a classic S curve. And do you think they're finally appreciating that something really big is going on?
No, the IEA has gone the other direction because of pressure from the Trump administration. So they're stuck in this system where they basically rely on government experts, not just to feed them the policy assumptions, but also feed them the official truth about what's going to happen. And so they're stuck with treating renewables as policy-driven, or clean energy as policy-driven, whereas the economics will always favor fossil fuels. And that's exactly the big picture assumption that has become obsolete in the past few years.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Trump. I mean, that's sort of the geopolitics here, I think, is really fascinating. You've got obviously China, dominating the sort of clean new world economy, if you like, and the US at the same time doubling down in fossil fuels and fossil fuel exports. And you've got this competition really where the US is in the old game essentially, and China's is leading the new game. They don't even begin to appreciate this, do they? They're sort of, I think Trump's they're anti-climate or anti-clean tech for ideological reasons, and it's almost like they don't care about the economics.
Yeah, no, it's very easy to point out to things like stopping an offshore wind farm that is already underway. There's absolutely no economic upside to that, and there's a massive downside. You don't get the clean electricity out of it, but also you do incredible damage to the U.S. as an investment destination. So certainly no economic motive there. There can be a much closer to home monetary motive for it, but certainly not the national economy. But so China's certainly stepping into that vacuum in a lot of ways. The clean energy collaboration financing that the US used to engage in many of those countries, China's stepping up and so on. I think though there are quite a few other countries that are also concerned about the high share of Chinese supply in a lot of the supply chains, and I think there's going to be quite a bit of diversification effort from others. India has already, for the past several years, has been building its own solar supply chains, and Europe will get there at some point, and so on. So it's not going to be a China-dominated picture to the extent that that is portrayed, but of course, China will remain the biggest player in all of this.
How does it? I don't know whether you have a direct line to Xi Jinping, but how does the Chinese leadership respond to watching the US just self-harm so obstinately? I mean, presumably they're celebrating, but do they really get quite how stupid and crazy the Trump administration is on this?
I think by now they do. So they've studied, of course, what Trump does, and that has shown in the way that they've responded to Trump's tariffs and everything else. I do think it's a mixed on the clean energy front and climate front. It's a mixed feeling. So on one hand, if the US was trying to improve its run on clean energy and trying to seriously build its own manufacturing base for clean energy and so on, I think that would put pressure on China to go faster, and so if they had a sense that they have competition, so that's a part of it. If the US was putting forward strong targets, was pushing others to do that, then that would also raise the bar for China in terms of setting climate targets and so on. And of course, during previous administrations, the Biden and the Obama administrations, climate change was viewed as a key positive aspect and opportunity for maintaining a better relationship with the US. So I don't think they're happy to see that part go. But yeah, of course, the massive damage that the US is doing to its stature in the world, I'm sure there's a the multipolar world that China's been talking about a long time has certainly been fast tracked.
Yeah. So just finally, why doesn't the Chinese leadership more consciously or self-consciously assume the mantle of international climate leadership. Like their latest NDC, their latest targets were actually quite conservative. I mean, they're probably below what they're going to achieve, a long way below. Why don't they just step up and say, no, we're going to do this. We're the ones who are solving this problem, and we're going to lead, clean energy transition into the 21st century. I mean, that would seem to me to, as a kind of PR person, to be the right way forward. But they don't seem to be getting that advice. I mean, do you have any kind of inside intel on this?
I can't call it inside intel, but my reading is that Xi Jinping basically started to do that with the targets that he announced in 2020, 2021, the carbon neutrality target, and then the targets that he announced for this decade as well. So reducing coal consumption from next year onwards and so on. And those were decisions that he took personally with a very small circle of people. And then what happened was that under zero COVID, during the pandemic, China's energy consumption and emissions grew much, much faster than before. China is now quite badly off track to the targets that he announced in 2021. So this time it seems to me that he was not willing to override what was coming from the bureaucracy, which is inherently conservative. And certainly the need, like what's the need to do that when if you see the US as your main competitor for us as the global leading power, then and they're having a tantrum on the floor, then you don't have to put your best effort forward. You can afford to focus on other priorities and leave more space for you to adapt what you're doing. So that certainly lowered the bar for China. And China's approach to climate and emissions also morphed quite a bit under zero COVID. So Xi Jinping's original idea was this top-down control, strictly control carbon emissions, carbon intensity, energy consumption, and so on. What it turned into is this massive scale-up of the supply of clean technologies and making them competitive against fossil fuels without much explicit drive from the demand side. So they just landed on a very different approach, and that doesn't really fit with strong emission targets.
Yeah, I remember when years ago Google had I think they called it REC, REC, like renewable energy cheaper than coal, and they failed to achieve that. China succeeded, and the world is changing dramatically as a result. And Lauri, it's been just fascinating hearing your insights on this. You're at the forefront of what is probably one of the biggest stories in the world right now, and will be for years to come. So if you don't mind, we'll come back to you again and carry on saving the world from bad ideas. But for now, I just want to say thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mark, and definitely happy to come on again.
Thanks so much for listening to Saving the World from Bad Ideas, a We Planet podcast. We Planet's a movement of citizens and scientists dedicated to defending the science and solutions we need to save the world. Please do subscribe and share a nice review. It helps us spread the message. We'd also love to hear your feedback and suggestions at our email, podcast@weplanet.org. Please also join our podcast mailing list and we'll let you know when a new episode drops. Just go to savingtheworldfrombadideas.org or weplanet.org/podcast right now. See you next time.